The Nebraska prairie stretched endless in every direction, a sea of yellowed grass bending under October winds that carried the first whispers of winter. In a soddy barely visible against the rolling hills, 23-year-old Margaret Whitley pressed her hand against the small of her back and watched the horizon through a window no bigger than a book. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 6 weeks, killed when his wagon overturned, crossing a swollen creek, and the child she carried was due any day now. She had no neighbors within 10 miles, no family within 1,000. And the supplies Thomas had meant to fetch from town still sat on a list pinned to the wall beside recipes she'd never have the ingredients to make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Soddy sat in a shallow depression where Lodgepole Creek made a lazy bend through land that had never known a plough before Thomas Whitley decided it should. 3 walls were cut, earth held together by prairie grass roots. The 4th was planks. Thomas had hauled 30 miles from the nearest timber. The roof was sod too, sprouting wildflowers in spring and leaking cold air now that autumn had turned serious. Margaret had helped build it 2 years ago, cutting the blocks herself, while Thomas drove the team, her hands blistering and her back aching in ways she'd never imagined back in Ohio, where her father's house had proper wooden floors and glass in every window. The single room measured 12 feet by 14. An iron stove squatted in one corner, its pipe jutting through the roof at an angle Thomas had never quite gotten right. Smoke sometimes backed up when the wind came from the northwest, filling the space with a haze that made Margaret's eyes water. Their bed was a frame Thomas had built from cottonwood, with rope webbing, and a mattress she'd sewn from flour sacks and filled with prairie grass that crackled whenever she shifted position. A table, 2 chairs, a trunk containing everything she'd brought from Ohio, and a shelf holding their few dishes completed the furnishings. The floor was packed earth that turned to dust in summer and mud in spring, though Margaret swept it every day regardless. She'd been alone for 42 days. The first week had been a shock, moving through tasks without really understanding that Thomas wouldn't be coming back through that plank door with his crooked smile and his habit of singing off-key while he worked. The second week had been grief so physical it felt like drowning, crying until her ribs ached and her eyes were swollen, unable to eat, barely able to stand. The third week she'd realized the baby would come whether she was ready or not, and she'd better start preparing because nobody else was going to do it for her. Thomas was buried on a rise a quarter-mile east, marked by a wooden cross she'd made from boards meant to build a chicken coop. She visited the grave every morning, talking to him about what needed doing, asking his advice on matters he'd always handled. Should she try to keep the cow through winter or sell her in town? Was there enough hay put up for the horses? Had he really thought they could make it out here? Or had he been as scared as she was now, just better at hiding it? The grave never answered, but the talking helped somehow, made her feel less like the only human being left in a world that stretched empty to every horizon. The cow was a brown and white beast named Patience, though the name was more hope than description. She gave 2 gallons a day, enough for Margaret to make butter and cheese and have some left over for drinking. The work of milking, straining and churning had fallen to Margaret now, added to the dozens of other tasks Thomas had handled. There were 2 horses, a matched pair of bays Thomas had been proud of that needed feeding and watering, chickens that needed their eggs collected and their coop cleaned, a garden that had already been harvested but still needed the dead plants pulled and composted, firewood to gather and stack, water to haul from the creek, clothes to wash and mend, bread to bake. She'd managed it all through September, working from dawn until dark, falling into bed so exhausted she barely dreamed. But October had brought complications. The baby sat heavy and low now, making it hard to bend, hard to walk without feeling like her hips might separate. Her back ached constantly, her feet were swollen. She couldn't get a full breath because the child was pressing up under her ribs. Tasks that had been routine now left her gasping and dizzy. 2 days ago, she'd tried to carry a bucket of water from the creek and had to stop 3 times to rest on the 50-yard walk back to the soddy. Yesterday, she'd dropped a basket of eggs because her fingers couldn't seem to grip properly, then cried over the waste of food she couldn't afford to lose. This morning, she'd barely been able to pull on her shoes, sitting on the edge of the bed for 20 minutes, just trying to catch her breath and work up the energy to face the day. The nearest neighbor was Samuel Porter, a bachelor who'd claimed land 10 miles southwest. She'd seen him exactly 3 times in 2 years, all of them chance meetings when Thomas had been riding fence or checking on their scattered cattle. Porter had seemed decent enough, quiet and weathered, but he wasn't the kind of man who'd think to check on a neighbor without reason. Besides, 10 miles might as well be 100 when she could barely walk to the creek. The nearest town was Elkhorn Station, population 47, according to the sign Thomas had laughed at when they'd first arrived. It sat 23 miles northeast, along a track that was generous to call a road. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a building that served as both church and school, and a collection of houses and soddles spread over a few dusty acres. A doctor passed through once a month on a circuit that covered 2 counties. Margaret had no way of knowing when he might next appear, and even if she knew, she had no way to get there. Thomas had been taking the wagon for supplies when he died. The wagon was still at the bottom of Salt Creek, wheels up, buried in mud and beyond recovery. She had the 2 horses, but she'd never saddled one in her life. Thomas had always done that. She'd ridden behind him a few times, holding on around his waist while he pointed out landmarks and described his plans for the land. She supposed she could learn to saddle a horse, but the thought of trying to ride 123 miles while 9 months pregnant seemed like a fantasy. Even if she managed it, even if she didn't fall off or go into labor halfway there, what then? Stay in town? She had $3.17 to her name, not enough for a week's room and board. The baby kicked, a sharp jab under her ribs that made her gasp. She pressed her hand against the spot and felt the movement beneath her palm. This person she'd never met, who was utterly dependent on her staying alive and capable. Thomas had been excited about the child in a way that had surprised her. Men back in Ohio treated pregnancy as women's business, something to be acknowledged but not discussed. Thomas had talked to her belly, his ear pressed against her stomach, claiming he could hear the baby's heartbeat. He'd carved a cradle from cedar he'd traded for, working on it by lamplight after long days in the field. The cradle sat in the corner now, lined with a blanket she'd knitted, waiting for an occupant. She'd prepared as best she could. There were clean linens in the trunk, strips of cloth for binding the cord, a knife she'd sharpened and set aside. She'd read the relevant chapter in her medical book so many times she had it memorized, though the clinical descriptions of labor stages and potential complications had done more to terrify than comfort her. The book assumed the presence of an experienced midwife or doctor. It offered little advice for a woman attempting childbirth alone in a soddy on the Nebraska prairie with the nearest help 10 miles away. Rain had fallen the day Thomas died, turning Salt Creek from a trickle you could step across into a brown torrent that swept the wagon downstream like a toy. He'd tried to cross at the usual ford, not realizing how fast the water had risen. The current had caught the wagon's right side, lifting it, spinning it. Thomas had jumped clear but hit his head on a rock in the water. They'd found him 3 miles downstream, face down in the shallows, the current still pulling at his clothes. Margaret had identified him by his boots and the silver buckle on his belt because his face had been too damaged to recognize. She'd buried him herself with help from Porter and 2 men from town who'd come out with the news. They'd offered to take her back with them, told her she couldn't possibly stay out here alone. She'd thanked them and said she'd be fine, that Thomas's brother would surely send for her soon, that she just needed some time. The brother was a fiction. Thomas had been an only child, and his parents were both dead. The men had looked skeptical but hadn't pressed. Western courtesy dictated you took people at their word, even when you suspected they were lying. That was 6 weeks ago, and no one had checked on her since. Why would they? She'd told them she was fine. She'd told them someone was coming. People had their own problems, their own land to work, their own struggles against weather and distance and the 100 things that could go wrong in this country. If Margaret Whitley said she was fine, then she was fine, and it wasn't neighbourly to suggest otherwise. Except she wasn't fine. Her back had been aching since before dawn, a low, persistent pain that wouldn't ease no matter how she positioned herself. She'd tried lying down, standing up, walking circles around the soddy's cramped interior. Nothing helped. The baby was pressing down in a way that felt different from yesterday, more urgent somehow, like it was testing the boundaries of the space it occupied. She'd had what she thought might be contractions during the night, irregular tightenings across her belly that came and went without pattern. They'd faded by morning, but the backache had remained. She told herself it was nothing. First babies took their time. The book said so. Some women had false labor for weeks before the real thing started. This was probably just her body preparing, not actual labor. The baby wasn't due for another week at least, maybe 2. She had time. Everything was fine. The wind picked up, whistling through gaps in the sod walls, making the stovepipe rattle. October in Nebraska meant cold nights and uncertain days, weather that could shift from mild to freezing in the space of hours. She needed to bring in more firewood before dark. The stack beside the stove was running low, and nights were getting cold enough that letting the fire die meant waking to ice in the water bucket. She also needed to milk patience, collect eggs, haul fresh water from the creek, normal daily tasks that suddenly felt impossible. She pulled on Thomas's coat, too large for her even with her belly, and stepped outside. The sky was grey, low clouds moving fast from the northwest, the kind of sky that threatened snow, even though it was only mid-October. The prairie grass had gone yellow and brown, winter colors, and the wind had an edge that cut through the coat's heavy wool. She stood for a moment, looking at the landscape that had killed her husband and might yet kill her. This beautiful, terrible emptiness that had seemed romantic when Thomas described it in letters back to Ohio. He'd come west first, filed his claim, built the soddy, then sent for her with promises of land and freedom and a future their children would inherit. She'd come because she loved him, because she was young enough to think love and adventure were the same thing, because Ohio had felt small and stifling with its rules and expectations. The prairie had been everything Thomas promised and nothing like she'd imagined. Bigger than seemed possible, lonelier than she'd thought she could bear, harder than any work she'd known. But they'd been happy. Thomas had sung while he worked, terrible songs he made up about stubborn mules and contrary weather. He'd held her at night and talked about the farm they'd build, the house with proper walls and floors, the children who'd grow up free and strong. Now Thomas was in the ground, and Margaret was alone, with a baby coming, and no earthly idea how she'd survive the winter, even if childbirth didn't kill her. The supplies they'd lived on were dwindling. The flour sack was half empty. The cornmeal was almost gone. She had potatoes from the garden and some preserved vegetables, salt pork in a barrel, dried beans, a little sugar, less coffee. Enough for maybe 6 weeks if she was careful. After that, nothing unless she somehow got to town for supplies she had no money to buy. The backache intensified, spreading around her sides to her belly. She gripped the doorframe and breathed through it, counting seconds until it eased. 30 seconds. 40. Then, slowly fading, not a contraction, just pain. Her body complaining about the weight it carried, the stress of the past weeks, the 1,000 difficulties of trying to survive alone in country that tested everyone and broke most. She'd rest after the chores. Just get through the necessary work, then lie down for a while. Everything would be fine. Everything had to be fine, because the alternative was unthinkable. She made herself walk to the chicken coop, a structure even more primitive than the soddy, just a lean-to of scrap boards with a wire fence Thomas had scavenged from an abandoned claim 20 miles east. The chickens scattered and complained when she reached for the eggs, their normal routine disrupted by her slower movements. She collected 7 eggs, careful not to drop them, cradling them in her skirt because she'd forgotten to bring the basket. The walk back to the soddy left her breathing hard, her vision spotting at the edges. Milking patience took longer than usual. The cow sensed something wrong and kept shifting, forcing Margaret to start over, her swollen fingers clumsy on the teats. By the time she finished, another contraction had come and gone, stronger than the last, definite enough that she couldn't pretend it was anything else. She sat on the milking stool afterward, waiting for her hands to stop shaking, watching the sky grow darker as the afternoon aged toward evening. The firewood couldn't wait. She needed heat to get through the night, needed the stove burning to boil water if the baby really was coming. She made 3 trips to the woodpile, carrying what she could, stopping twice when contractions hit, standing bent and gasping until they passed. The intervals between them were maybe 30 minutes, maybe less. Hard to tell when she was focused on just getting through each task, each moment, each breath. By the time she had enough wood stacked, by the time she'd hauled a bucket of water from the creek and fed the horses and secured the chicken coop against nighttime predators, the sun was setting and the contractions were 20 minutes apart. Regular enough that denial was no longer possible, close enough that town was out of the question even if she'd had a way to get there. She was going to have this baby here, tonight, alone in a soddy on the prairie with nothing but a medical book and determination to see her through. She lit the lamp, fed the stove, set water to boil. She laid out the clean linens and the knife and the cord ties. She read the relevant chapter in the medical book one more time, though the words barely registered through her growing fear. First stage of labor could last hours, even days with first births. Second stage, active pushing, was shorter but more intense. Third stage was delivery of the afterbirth. Complications included hemorrhaging, fever, cord problems, positioning difficulties, a dozen things that could go wrong and kill both mother and child. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She paced the soddy's small space between contractions, her hand pressed to her lower back. Outside, full dark had fallen, and the wind was picking up. She could hear coyotes in the distance, their yipping calls carrying across the empty miles. The lamp flickered. The stove ticked as metal expanded with heat. The baby shifted inside her, restless, preparing for the journey it would have to make from the only home it had ever known into a world considerably less welcoming. Margaret had never felt more alone in her life, never more aware of the vast indifference of the prairie, the miles and miles of empty grass where a woman could die in childbirth, and the wind would blow, and the seasons would change, and nothing would mark her passing but a second grave beside her husband's. She thought about Thomas, about how he'd promised to take care of her, how he'd died trying to do exactly that, fetching supplies for a winter he'd never see. She thought about her mother in Ohio, who'd begged her not to go west, who'd said the frontier was no place for decent people. She thought about the baby, this person who'd never asked to be born into such circumstances, who deserved better than a terrified mother and a soddy on the prairie and a future uncertain as tomorrow's weather. Then another contraction hit, harder than the ones before, and thinking became impossible. There was only pain and breathing and the animal necessity of getting through it. This was happening. The baby was coming. Margaret Whitley would either survive the night or she wouldn't, but either way, she'd face it the same way she'd faced everything since Thomas died. Alone, doing what had to be done, because there was literally no other choice. The contractions had settled into a rhythm by midnight, coming every 15 minutes with a regularity that would have been reassuring if each one wasn't stronger than the last. Margaret had abandoned the bed an hour ago, finding that movement helped more than lying still. She walked tight circles around the stove, one hand braced against her belly, the other gripping whatever furniture she passed when the pain surged. The medical book lay open on the table, its diagrams and clinical language useless now that theory had become brutal physical reality. She'd tried to time the contractions using Thomas's pocket watch, but keeping track of minutes required focus she couldn't maintain. The pain built like a wave, starting low in her back and spreading forward until her entire middle was seized in a grip that made breathing an act of will. She'd count through them, reaching 30 or 40 before the worst passed, leaving her shaking and slick with sweat despite the October cold seeping through the walls. Around 2 in the morning, something changed. The contractions shifted, moving lower, accompanied by pressure that made her gasp. She felt wetness between her legs and panicked before remembering the book's description of waters breaking. She managed to get her skirt off, her undergarments, wrapping herself in one of the clean sheets she'd prepared. The pragmatic part of her mind noted she'd need to clean up afterward, assuming there was an afterward, assuming she survived to worry about such mundane concerns. The pressure increased. Not quite the urge to push the book described, but getting closer. She tried to remember how long the first stage was supposed to last, but the information slipped away every time a contraction hit. Hours, certainly. Maybe many hours. The thought of enduring this pain for 6 or 8 or 12 more hours seemed impossible, yet women did it every day, had done it since the beginning of time. She'd do it too, because the alternative was dying, and Margaret Whitley had not come this far to give up now. She was bent over the table, breathing through another contraction, when she heard the horse. At first she thought she'd imagined it, her mind conjuring phantom sounds from desperation. But then it came again. Definitely hoofbeats, moving at a walk, coming closer, her heart hammered with sudden wild hope. Porter checking on her, finally. Someone from town, anyone who could help, who could keep her from facing this completely alone. The hoofbeats stopped outside. She heard boots hit the ground, heard a man's voice speaking low to his mount. Then silence, long enough that she wondered if she'd dreamed it after all. Then a knock, firm but not demanding, and a voice calling through the door. "Ma'am? Saw your light from the ridge. Is everything all right there?" Not Porter's voice. Someone else. A stranger. Margaret's relief tangled with new fear. A woman alone on the prairie was vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with childbirth. Stories circulated about drifters, outlaws, men who'd do terrible things if they thought they could get away with it. But another contraction was building, and she was wrapped in a sheet, and the baby was coming, whether this stranger was a friend or threat. "I'm in labor," she called out, her voice thin. "The baby's coming." Silence again. Long enough that she thought he might leave, might ride away and abandon her to whatever came next. Then, "You alone in there, ma'am?" "Yes." The contraction hit, and she couldn't keep the groan from escaping, doubling over the table, knuckles white against the wood. She heard him swear, soft but audible through the plank wall. Then, "I'm gonna need you to unlock this door. Can you do that?" Margaret stumbled to the door, still hunched against the pane. Her fingers fumbled with the bar Thomas had installed, heavy timber meant to keep out wolves, and worse. She got it loose and staggered back as the door swung inward, bringing cold air and lamplight's gleam on a tall figure silhouetted against the darkness. He stepped inside and shut the door quickly, blocking the wind. In the lamplight she saw a man maybe 30 years old, trail-worn and lean, wearing a canvas coat stained with travel and a hat pulled low against the weather. His face was weathered but not unkind, dark eyes taking in the soddy's cramped space, the labouring woman wrapped in a sheet, the preparations laid out on the table. He removed his hat, revealing brown hair in need of cutting. "Name's Jacob Brennan," he said. "I'm just passing through Elkhorn Station. Been riding since dawn. Saw your light and thought I'd check if you needed anything." His eyes moved to her belly, to the sheet she clutched around herself, to the medical book open on the table. "Appears you need considerably more than I bargained for." Another contraction seized her and she couldn't answer, could only grip the table edge and try to breathe. She heard him move, heard water pouring, heard him speaking in a low, steady voice that seemed to come from very far away. "All right, ma'am. I need you to focus on my voice. I've done this before. Not with people, mind you. But I've pulled calves and foals, and I figure the principle's roughly the same. You're going to get through this, and so is that baby. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She managed a nod, not because she trusted him, but because she had no choice. He was here, he was willing to help, and the baby was coming regardless of whether he was qualified or she was ready. Trust was irrelevant. Necessity was all that mattered. When the contraction passed, she found him washing his hands in the basin, scrubbing methodically like he'd done this 100 times. He'd removed his coat, rolled up his sleeves. His hands were scarred and capable, the hands of someone who'd worked with animals and tools in hard country. "How long you been laboring?" he asked, not looking at her, focused on getting clean. "Since afternoon. Maybe longer. They're close now. Every few minutes." He nodded, drying his hands on a clean cloth. "Your husband around?" "Dead. 6 weeks ago." That stopped him. He turned to look at her fully, something shifting in his expression. "You've been out here alone? 9 months pregnant, and you've been managing this place by yourself?" Wasn't much choice in the matter. "No, I suppose there wasn't." He pulled one of the chairs closer to the bed. "All right, I need you to lie down. Let me see how far along you are. This is going to be uncomfortable, but I need to know what we're dealing with." Margaret lowered herself to the bed, still clutching the sheet, modesty warring with necessity. Another contraction hit before she was settled, and she cried out, unable to stop herself. Brennan waited until it passed, his face neutral, patient. When she could breathe again, he examined her with hands that were surprisingly gentle despite their roughness. "You're close," he said, sitting back. "Real close. I'd say within the hour you'll be pushing whether you want to or not." He stood, moving to the stove. "When's the last time you drank anything?" She couldn't remember. Sometime that afternoon, maybe. Water hadn't seemed important compared to everything else. He found a cup, filled it from the kettle, brought it to her. "Small sips. You're gonna need your strength." The water was warm and tasted of metal from the kettle, but it eased her dry throat. She managed half the cup before another contraction made her spill the rest. Brennan took the cup away without comment, set it aside. He found the clean linens she'd prepared, spread one beneath her on the bed. His movements were efficient, practiced, like he'd worked in tight spaces before and knew how to make do with what was available. "Tell me about the contractions," he said. "How long between them?" 5 minutes, maybe less. "And the pain, where's it worst?" "Low. Everything is low. And my back." He nodded like this confirmed something. "That's normal. Babies moving into position, pressing on things that don't appreciate being pressed on. Won't be long now." She wanted to ask how he knew, wanted to demand his qualifications for delivering a human child when he'd admitted his experience was with livestock. But another contraction hit, and questions became impossible. This one was different, stronger, accompanied by an urge to push that overrode everything else. She bore down instinctively, her body taking over where her mind couldn't function. "Not yet," Brennan said sharply. "Don't push yet. Let me check first." "Can't help it," she gasped, when the contraction eased enough for speech. "Body's doing it anyway." He examined her again, his face serious in the lamplight. "All right. Next one, you can push. Baby's ready. You're ready. We're doing this now." Terror gripped her harder than any contraction. This was it. No more waiting, no more hoping someone more qualified would appear. Just her, and this stranger and a baby determined to enter the world in a soddy on the Nebraska prairie with October wind howling outside and coyotes singing in the darkness. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Brennan's eyes met hers, steady and sure. "You've been doing impossible things for 6 weeks. This is just one more, and you're not alone anymore. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere until that baby's born, and you're both safe. Understand?" She nodded, wanting to believe him, needing to believe him because belief was all she had left. The next contraction built like a storm, and this time, when her body demanded she push, Brennan didn't stop her. She bore down with everything she had, feeling pressure and stretching and pain that made the earlier contractions seem mild by comparison. It lasted forever and ended too soon, leaving her gasping and exhausted. "Good," Brennan said. "That was good. I can see the head. One more like that and we'll have this baby. One more." She could do one more. Except the contractions kept coming, and one more became two more, became three, became a string of efforts that blurred together until she lost track of everything except the overwhelming need to push. Brennan's voice stayed constant, guiding her, telling her when to push and when to rest, his hands ready to catch what was coming. "All right, big push now, as hard as you can. Baby's almost here." She pushed, feeling something shift and release, and suddenly Brennan was lifting a tiny red-faced creature into the lamplight, a sound like an angry kitten filling the soddy. A baby, her baby, alive and furious and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Brennan said, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. "You have a daughter." He worked quickly, tying off the cord in two places, cutting between them with the knife Margaret had prepared. The baby screamed louder, arms and legs flailing. Brennan wrapped her in one of the clean cloths, wiped her face, then placed her on Margaret's chest. The weight of her was nothing, barely more than a thought, but the reality of her was everything. Margaret's hands came up automatically, cradling this person who hadn't existed in the world 10 minutes ago, this tiny, fierce creature who was half Thomas and half herself, and wholly her own being. The baby's cries softened to whimpers, then to quiet breathing. Her eyes were unfocused, dark, searching for something to anchor on. "Hello," Margaret whispered. "Hello, little one. I'm your mama." Brennan was still working, delivering the afterbirth, checking to make sure everything had come away clean. Margaret barely noticed, lost in the wonder of her daughter's face, the perfect tiny fingers, the dark hair plastered against her skull. "You did real good," Brennan said quietly. "Both of you. She's healthy. You're healthy. That's about as good as it gets." Margaret looked up at him, this stranger who'd appeared out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." He shook his head. "You'd have managed. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most of them without help. You're stronger than you think." But she could see in his face that he didn't entirely believe it, that he knew how close things had been to going wrong. The baby could have been breech, could have been tangled in the cord, could have come too fast or too slow, or 100 other complications that would have killed them both. Luck had been on their side tonight. Luck and a stranger who'd happened to see a light from a ridge and decided to check if everything was all right. The baby nursed for the first time, latching instinctively, and Margaret felt her body respond in ways the medical book had described, but she hadn't really understood until now. Connection, profound and physical, this person entirely dependent on her for survival. The responsibility of it should have been terrifying, but somehow it wasn't. Somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Brennan cleaned up with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown throughout, disposing of soiled linens, washing his hands again, banking the fire in the stove. He moved like someone accustomed to taking care of himself, to doing necessary work without being asked. When everything was in order, he pulled on his coat, picked up his hat. "I'll bed down in your lean-to if that's all right," he said. "Check on the livestock. Make sure everything's secure. You need anything before I go?" "You're staying?" He paused at the door. "Storm's coming. Can smell it on the wind. Besides, you just had a baby. You shouldn't be alone, not tonight. I'll sleep out with my horse, head on to Elkhorn Station in the morning once I'm sure you're managing all right." Relief flooded through her so strong it brought tears. One more night of not being alone. One more night of someone else being responsible, being capable, being there. "Thank you. Truly." He nodded and slipped outside, closing the door against the cold. Margaret heard him moving around, heard him talking to the horses in that same low, steady voice he'd used with her. The baby slept against her chest, warm and impossibly small. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the stovepipe, carrying the smell of snow. Margaret closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her, trusting for the first time in 6 weeks that she could sleep without disaster striking. The baby was born. She'd survived. And tomorrow, when the stranger named Jacob Brennan rode away toward Elkhorn Station, she'd figure out what came next. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she was simply grateful to be alive. Margaret woke to grey dawn light filtering through the soddy's single window and the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. For a moment she couldn't place the sound of someone moving quietly in the cramped space. Then memory flooded back. The baby, the stranger, the long, terrible night that had somehow ended with both of them alive. The infant lay in the cradle Thomas had carved, swaddled in blankets, sleeping with the boneless abandon of the newly born. Margaret's body ached in ways she'd never experienced, muscles she hadn't known existed, protesting when she tried to sit up. Everything felt wrong and rearranged, hollow where the baby had been, sore everywhere else. Jacob Brennan stood at the stove with his back to her, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He'd clearly been awake for some time. The fire was built up hot, fresh wood stacked beside it. Through the window she could see he'd already fed the horses, and the cow was standing by the fence rather than bawling for attention. "Snowing," he said without turning around. "Started about an hour before dawn. Already got 3 inches on the ground, and it's not letting up." Margaret struggled to process this information through the fog of exhaustion and pain. Snow meant she couldn't travel even if she'd been capable of it. Snow meant anyone from town couldn't reach her either. Snow in mid-October wasn't unheard of, but it was early, and early snow often meant a hard winter coming. Brennan turned and brought her one of the cups. "How you feeling?" "Like I was trampled by something large." She took the coffee gratefully, the warmth of the cup good against her palms. "That's about right for what you went through." He gestured to the cradle. "She woke up about an hour ago, fussing. I changed her swaddling, but I figure she's probably hungry. I don't know much about feeding babies." The matter-of-fact way he said it, acknowledging both what he'd done and what he didn't know, eased something tight in Margaret's chest. She set down the coffee and reached for the baby, who was indeed starting to make small, querulous sounds that would soon become full-throated demands. The child latched on with surprising strength, and Margaret winced at the pull of it. Brennan moved to the table, giving her privacy even in the soddy's limited space. He'd found the heel of bread she'd baked 3 days ago and was cutting thin slices, toasting them over the stove. The domesticity of the scene felt surreal. Yesterday she'd been alone and terrified. Now a stranger was making breakfast in her home while snow fell outside and a baby nursed at her breast. "Storm looks like it might last a while," Brennan said, still focused on the bread. "I went out to check the lean-to, make sure it wasn't leaking. Found some gaps in the boarding that need fixing before the weather gets worse. Your cow's producing, but she needs grain you don't have. Chickens are fine, but that coop won't hold up to serious wind. And you're nearly out of firewood." He delivered this assessment without judgment, just facts that needed addressing. Margaret felt defensive anyway, knowing how inadequate her preparations looked to someone who clearly knew what he was doing. "Thomas was supposed to fetch supplies before winter," she said quietly. "That's what he was doing when he died." Brennan nodded, bringing her the toasted bread on one of the tin plates. Figured it was something like that. Man who'd build a place like this, get a woman with child out here, he wouldn't leave her unprepared by choice. The bread was crisp and tasted faintly of smoke. Margaret ate it mechanically, fueling a body that felt like it belonged to someone else. The baby finished nursing and needed to be burped, another task the medical book had described, but Margaret had never actually performed. She held the infant against her shoulder and patted awkwardly until a satisfying belch emerged, followed by a considerable amount of spit-up down her back. Brennan handed her a cloth without comment. "They do that. Foals are the same, eating more than they can hold, making a mess of everything. You keep comparing my daughter to livestock. Just noting similarities in young creatures generally, didn't mean offense by it." Margaret cleaned herself up as best she could, acutely aware that she needed a proper washing and fresh clothes and about 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep. None of those things were immediately available. The baby needed holding and feeding and changing. The storm outside needed weathering, and Jacob Brennan needed to explain why he was still here instead of riding toward Elkhorn Station. "The snow," she said. "You can't travel in this." "Probably could if I had to. Horse is sure-footed, knows how to handle weather. But I've been thinking on your situation here, and it seems to me you're in a bad spot. I'll manage." "Will you?" He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You've just had a baby. You can barely walk. You've got maybe 6 weeks of food if you stretch it. No money to buy more, no way to get to town even if you had funds. Winter's coming early and hard, by the look of that sky. Your buildings aren't secure. You're low on firewood and every other supply that matters. And now you've got an infant to care for on top of everything else." Each point landed like a physical blow because each one was true. Margaret felt tears threatening and forced them back. She didn't need this stranger cataloguing her failures, pointing out how hopeless her situation was. "So what do you suggest?" The words came out sharper than intended. "I can't exactly leave. This land is all I have. The homestead claim requires I prove it up or lose everything Thomas worked for." Brennan crossed his arms, leaning against the rough wall. "I'm suggesting I stay. Couple weeks, maybe a month, get you through the worst of it. Fix what needs fixing, hunt some meat, make sure you and the baby are set up proper before winter really hits." Margaret stared at him. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "No, I don't. But I'm not the kind of man who can ride away knowing a woman and baby are likely to freeze or starve before spring. Call it conscience if you want, or just basic decency. Point is, you need help, and I'm able to provide it. I have $3 to my name. I can't pay you." "Didn't ask for payment. Then what do you want?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither acknowledged directly. A woman, alone with a stranger, dependent on his help, vulnerable in every way that mattered. The stories she'd heard back in Ohio came flooding back, cautionary tales about what happened to women who trusted the wrong men. Brennan seemed to understand what she was asking beneath the words. "What I want is to help someone who needs it, then move on with a clear conscience. That's all. You've got my word. I won't lay a hand on you except as needed for work around this place. I'll sleep in the lean-to with my horse, take my meals separate if you prefer. You want me to leave at any point, I'll go, no questions asked." He met her eyes steadily, not pushing, not pleading, just offering. Margaret wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to maintain the fiction that she could handle everything herself. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The baby was real. The storm was real. The empty shelves and failing structures and approaching winter were all brutally, undeniably real. 2 weeks, she heard herself say. "You can stay 2 weeks, help me get things in order, then you go on to wherever you're headed." Something shifted in Brennan's face, relief maybe, or satisfaction at a decision made. 2 weeks then. Now you need rest, and that baby's going to want feeding again soon. I'm going to shore up the lean-to before this snow gets worse, then see about getting more firewood stacked. You just focus on healing and keeping that child alive." He pulled on his coat and hat, wrapped a scarf around his face against the cold, and stepped out into the blowing snow. Through the window, Margaret watched him trudge toward the lean-to, already barely visible through the white curtain of falling flakes. She looked down at the baby in her arms, at this tiny person who'd upended everything, who'd brought a stranger into their lives at the exact moment they needed him most. "I hope I'm not making a terrible mistake," she whispered to the sleeping infant. "But I suppose we're about to find out." The morning passed in a blur of feeding and changing and trying to stay warm while Brennan worked outside. Margaret could hear him hammering, the sound muffled by snow and wind, but regular and purposeful. Around midday he came in stamping snow from his boots. his face red with cold, ice crusted in his beard. "Lean-to's secure," he reported. "Found some loose boards, nailed them tight. Your horses are good for now, but that fence line's sagging in 2 places. I'll need to fix it before the animals push through and wander off. Also, you're completely out of grain. What have you been feeding them?" "Prairie hay, Thomas, cut in August. There's some stacked behind the soddy." Brennan nodded. "I saw it. It'll do for the horses, but the cow needs better. She's producing for you and the baby. She needs proper feed. I'm going to have to make a run to Elkhorn Station once this storm clears. Pick up supplies. I told you, I don't have money. I've got money. You can pay me back come spring when you sell butter or eggs or whatever you produce, or don't pay me back at all. I'm not particular. Point is, the cow needs grain, and you need a dozen other things to get through winter." Margaret wanted to argue, but the baby started crying, that escalating wail that demanded immediate attention. She fumbled with her clothing, trying to get the infant positioned to nurse while maintaining some shred of modesty. Brennan turned his back without being asked, busying himself with the stove. "There's salt pork in the barrel," Margaret said over the baby's cries. "And some beans. Potatoes in the basket by the door. It's not much, but you're welcome to it. I'll make us something hot. You just tend to your daughter." The casual way he said, "your daughter," made Margaret realize they hadn't discussed names. The baby was nearly a day old and still unnamed, which seemed wrong somehow. Thomas had wanted to name a daughter after his mother, Elizabeth. But Thomas was dead, and the baby was here, and Margaret found she wanted to choose the name herself. "Sarah," she said suddenly. "I'm calling her Sarah." Brennan glanced over his shoulder. "That's a good, strong name. Suits her." He made a soup of sorts, boiling the salt pork with potatoes and beans until everything was soft and edible, if not particularly flavorful. The warmth of it was what mattered, filling Margaret's empty stomach, giving her body fuel to make milk for Sarah. They ate in companionable silence, the storm still raging outside, the soddy feeling smaller and more crowded with Brennan's presence, but somehow less lonely. After the meal, he cleaned the dishes without being asked, his movements economical in the cramped space. Margaret watched him work, trying to reconcile this careful domesticity with her preconceptions about drifters and cowboys and men who traveled alone. Everything about Brennan suggested competence and self-sufficiency, but there was a gentleness, too, in how he handled her things, in how he'd delivered Sarah, in how he'd given his word about leaving if she asked. "Where were you headed?" she asked. "Before you stopped here." "Elkhorn Station, like I said. Got a telegram waiting for me there, at least I hope I do. Job offer working cattle on a ranch up north in the Dakota Territory. Good wages, decent outfit from what I hear." "But you're delaying us. You might lose the position." Brennan shrugged. "There's always another job, another ranch. Cattle work doesn't change much from one place to the next. But I can't unring this bell. Can't unknow that you're here needing help. So I help first, worry about jobs later." The simple morality of it made Margaret's throat tight. In her experience, men didn't work that way, didn't sacrifice opportunity for principle, especially not for strangers. Her father had been calculating, always weighing costs against benefits. Thomas had been kind but practical, making decisions based on what served their interests best. This man sitting in her soddy eating thin soup seemed to operate on some different code entirely. "When the storm clears, I'll need to assess the whole property," Brennan said, steering the conversation to practical matters. "See what else needs fixing or reinforcing. That fence line is urgent, and I noticed your well looks like it might freeze solid come real cold. We'll need to insulate it somehow, maybe build housing around it. How much land have you got under cultivation?" 40 acres plowed. Thomas had plans for more, but she trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. 40's ambitious for one man. He must have been a hard worker. He was. He believed in this place, believed we could build something permanent. A real farm, proper buildings, maybe hire help eventually. He had plans for everything. Plans are good until they meet reality. Reality doesn't care much about plans. It was possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to her since Thomas died. Everyone else had offered platitudes about God's will and things happening for a reason. Brennan just acknowledged the brutal randomness of it, the way life could end in a swollen creek for no better reason than bad timing and bad luck. Sarah fussed and Margaret shifted her to the other breast, no longer self-conscious about it. Brennan kept his attention on the window, watching snow accumulate against the glass. "This keeps up, we're going to be snowed in for a few days at least," he observed. "Good thing I stayed. You'd have been in a bad way trying to manage livestock and a newborn in this weather alone." Margaret couldn't argue with that assessment. Just the thought of trying to milk patients or feed the horses while recovering from childbirth made her exhausted. Having Brennan here doing the heavy work felt like a reprieve she hadn't known she desperately needed. The afternoon wore on with the storm showing no signs of abating. Brennan made another trip outside to check on the animals, came back reporting everything secure but the temperature dropping fast. He stoked the fire high, burning through firewood at a rate that would have worried Margaret, except he'd already promised to cut more when the weather allowed. By evening, Sarah had settled into a pattern of sleeping and waking and nursing that Margaret hoped would continue. Brennan rigged a blanket across one corner of the soddy, creating a makeshift private area where he said he'd sleep rather than brave the storm to reach the lean-to. Margaret protested weakly, but was secretly relieved. The thought of being completely alone in the storm with a day-old baby had been more frightening than she wanted to admit. Night fell early and dark, the storm blocking whatever moonlight might have shone through. Brennan banked the fire so it would burn through till morning, then settled behind his blanket curtain. Margaret lay in the bed with Sarah beside her in the cradle Thomas had made, listening to the wind howl and snow hiss against the walls. "Brennan?" she called softly into the darkness. "Ma'am? Thank you for everything. For staying." A pause then. "You're welcome. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to get you through winter." Margaret closed her eyes, one hand resting on Sarah's cradle, rocking it gently. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt something close to hope. Not certainty, not safety, but the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they'd all survive this after all. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the prairie under white silence, erasing tracks and boundaries, and the clear demarcation between where one day ended and the next began. Inside the soddy, 3 people weathered it together, an unlikely alliance forged from necessity and maintained by the simple human need to not face the darkness alone. The storm blew itself out on the 3rd day, leaving the prairie transformed under 18 inches of snow that glittered hard and bright beneath a sky gone crystalline blue. Margaret stood at the window with Sarah bundled against her chest, watching Brennan shovel a path from the soddy to the lean-to, his breath puffing white in air, cold enough to make the morning water bucket freeze solid. Her body was healing faster than she'd expected, though everything still felt strange and tender. The bleeding had slowed to something manageable, and she could walk without feeling like her insides might fall out. Sarah nursed well and slept in reasonable stretches, which the medical book had suggested was more luck than anything Margaret was doing right. 3 days of relative rest, of having someone else handle the brutal physical labor, had done more for her recovery than she'd thought possible. Brennan had proved relentless in his efficiency. When he wasn't tending livestock or reinforcing structures, he was inventorying supplies and making lists of what they'd need before real winter arrived. He'd found Thomas's tools and put them to better use than Thomas ever had. His hands practiced at carpentry and metalwork and a dozen other skills that came from years of making do in hard country. The fence line was his current project. He'd spent yesterday walking the entire perimeter, marking weak spots with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. Today he was repairing them systematically, replacing rotted posts and tightening wire that had gone slack. Margaret could see him now beyond the lean-to, working steadily despite a cold that had to be numbing his fingers, even through gloves. She'd learned things about him in fragments over the past days. He was from Kansas originally, had left home at 16 after his father died, and the farm went to an older brother. He'd worked cattle drives, mined for silver in Colorado, built a railroad in Wyoming. He'd been married once, briefly, to a woman who died of pneumonia their first winter together. That piece of information had come out matter-of-factly while he was fixing the stove damper, delivered in the same tone he might use to report the weather. "Long time ago now," he'd said when Margaret expressed sympathy. 8 years. A man moves on, or he doesn't, and I figured moving on was better than the alternative. She wondered if that was why he drifted, why he took temporary work and never seemed to settle anywhere. Running from grief, or maybe just running because motion was easier than stillness. She understood that impulse better now than she would have a year ago. If she'd had anywhere to run after Thomas died, she might have done the same. Sarah stirred against her chest and made small, seeking motions with her mouth. Margaret settled into the chair Brennan had reinforced, nursing while watching him work outside. There was something meditative about his movements, the steady rhythm of labor performed by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. No wasted motion, no frustration when something didn't work the first time, just patience and persistence until the job was done right. Around midday he came in, stamping snow from his boots, his face raw from wind exposure, despite the scarf wrapped around his neck. Margaret had learned to have coffee ready when he came inside, and a plate of whatever food she'd managed to prepare with their dwindling supplies. Today it was cornbread, made with the last of the cornmeal, dense and plain but filling. "Fence is solid now," he reported, warming his hands at the stove. "Took longer than expected, but it'll hold against the animals and weather both. I'm thinking tomorrow I ride to Elkhorn Station, pick up those supplies. Storm's cleared enough. The road should be passable." Margaret felt her stomach tighten at the thought of him leaving, even temporarily. 3 days of not being alone had made the prospect of solitude frightening again. But they needed supplies desperately, and there was no one else to fetch them. "How long will you be gone?" "Day there, day back if the weather holds. Maybe 2 days total. You've got enough firewood stacked to last a week if you're careful with it, and I'll leave extra water hauled from the creek. The animals are fed and secure. You shouldn't have to go outside for anything. What if something happens? What if Sarah gets sick, or I? Then you handle it the way you've been handling everything else. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about hearing it in his voice made her chest constrict. "But nothing's going to happen. I'll be back before you have time to miss me." She wanted to tell him she already missed having another adult to talk to, missed the sound of someone else moving around, missed knowing she wasn't solely responsible for every decision and crisis. But admitting that felt like weakness, like dependence she couldn't afford. So instead, she just nodded and watched him eat his cornbread, strong, capable hands handling the fragile corn cake with surprising delicacy. After the meal, he spent the afternoon hunting, returning near dusk with 2 rabbits already skinned and cleaned. He hung them from a rafter to freeze, then came inside looking more satisfied than she'd seen him. "Fresh meat," he announced. "Saw deer sign, too, about a mile west along the creek. Once I'm back from town, I'll go after one, get you set up with venison for the winter." Margaret tried to imagine managing without him and couldn't quite picture it. She'd done it before he arrived, but that had been survival, not actually managing. The difference between barely hanging on and having a plan for the future felt like a vast gulf she couldn't cross alone. "You've done so much already," she said quietly. "More than I had any right to expect from a stranger." Brennan looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "We're not exactly strangers anymore. Seems to me delivering a woman's baby and fixing her fences puts us past that. What are we then?" He considered the question seriously, not deflecting with humor or dismissing it as unimportant. "Partners, I suppose. Temporarily." Two people helping each other through a difficult situation. Partners. The word felt right and wrong simultaneously. Right, because it acknowledged what they were building here, this fragile alliance based on mutual need and unexpected respect. Wrong because it implied equality, when the reality was she needed him far more than he needed her. "When you go to town," Margaret said, changing the subject before her thoughts could spiral darker, "could you post a letter for me? I should write to Thomas's cousin in Iowa, let them know about Sarah. They'll want to know he has a daughter, even if he's not here to meet her." "Of course. You write it tonight. I'll make sure it gets posted." That evening, after Brennan had retreated behind his blanket curtain and Sarah was asleep in her cradle, Margaret sat at the table with paper and pen, trying to find words for what had happened. "How did you tell someone their cousin was dead? How did you explain you'd nearly died yourself, bringing his child into the world, saved only by the intervention of a passing stranger who'd had no obligation to help?" She started 3 times, wadding up false beginnings and tossing them in the stove. Finally, she settled on simple facts. Thomas died crossing Salt Creek. The baby came early. A man named Jacob Brennan helped deliver her. We're managing. The baby's name is Sarah. I thought you'd want to know. It felt inadequate, reducing all the terror and grief and unexpected grace to a few spare sentences. But there was no way to capture the truth of it in words that wouldn't sound melodramatic or desperate. She sealed the letter and set it aside for Brennan to take to town. Sleep came easier that night, her body adjusting to Sarah's rhythms, her mind less frantic now that immediate crises had been addressed. She woke once in the deep hours to nurse the baby and heard Brennan moving behind his curtain, restless. She wondered what kept him awake, what ghosts visited him in the darkness. A dead wife, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of years spent drifting, never settling, always moving toward the next job and the next empty horizon. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of crystalline winter day that made the prairie look almost beautiful despite its harshness. Brennan was up before dawn, packing supplies for the ride to Elkhorn Station. He'd saddled his horse and loaded saddlebags with items to trade or sell, trying to maximize what he could buy with the limited funds available. Margaret made him breakfast, using the last of their flour for biscuits that came out heavy but edible. She packed extra for him to eat on the trail, along with strips of the salt pork and a canteen filled with coffee that would go cold, but was better than nothing. "I'll be careful with your money," Brennan said, accepting the bundle of food. "Buy what's essential first, then see what else I can manage. Grain for the cow is priority, then flour and cornmeal. Coffee if there's funds left, though I know that's more want than need." "Get the coffee," Margaret said. "Some things are worth the expense." He smiled at that, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his weathered face into something younger and less guarded. "Yes, ma'am. Coffee it is." Outside, his horse waited patient and frost-covered, breath steaming in the early light. Brennan swung into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time mounted than on foot. He looked down at Margaret, standing in the doorway with Sarah, bundled against the cold. "Keep the door barred when I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone unless you're absolutely certain who it is, and if something feels wrong, trust that feeling." "You've got Thomas's rifle?" "Yes, I know how to shoot it." "Good. Hopefully you won't need to, but it's better to have it and not need it than the reverse. I'll be back tomorrow evening if all goes well, the morning after if it doesn't." He turned the horse toward the faint track that passed for a road, then paused and looked back. "You're going to be fine, Margaret. You and Sarah both. You've survived this long, you'll survive 2 more days." Then he was riding away, the horse breaking through drifted snow, heading northeast toward town and civilization and all the things that existed beyond this isolated soddy on the Nebraska prairie. Margaret watched until he disappeared over a rise, then went inside and barred the door as instructed. The silence felt oppressive without him, the soddy shrinking back to its real dimensions after seeming larger with his presence. Sarah slept in her cradle, oblivious to the departure, but Margaret felt the weight of solitude pressing down like a physical thing. She'd wanted independence, had resented needing help, and now that she was alone again, she found it terrifying rather than empowering. She forced herself through the day's necessary tasks, nursing Sarah, changing her cloths, keeping the fire fed. She ventured outside briefly to check on the animals, found them all secure as Brennan had promised. Patience, the cow lowed softly, and Margaret leaned against her warm flank for a moment, drawing comfort from the simple animal presence. The chickens had stopped laying with the cold weather, roosting in their makeshift coop with feathers fluffed against the temperature. The horses stood hip-shot in the lean-to, conserving energy. Everything Brennan had built or fixed held solid against the elements. His work was thorough, meant to last, which made her wonder again why a man with such skills chose to drift rather than settle. Back inside, she tried to occupy herself with mending, with organizing their meager supplies, with anything that would keep her mind from spiraling into worry. What if Brennan didn't come back? What if he reached town and decided this wasn't his problem, that he'd done enough? What if something happened to him on the trail and she never knew, just waited and waited until she understood he'd abandoned her? Sarah woke crying, and Margaret nursed her, using the task to ground herself in present reality. The baby was real. The soddy was real. Tomorrow Brennan would return, or he wouldn't, and she'd deal with whatever came the same way she'd dealt with everything else since Thomas died, by doing what had to be done, hour by hour, until the crisis passed or she did. Evening fell early, and Margaret barred the door against the darkness, feeding the fire high against cold that crept through every gap in the walls. She ate sparingly from their supplies, trying to make everything stretch until Brennan returned with more. The rabbits he'd caught hung frozen from the rafters, insurance against true hunger, but not something she could cook for herself easily. Thomas had always handled the meat preparation, and she'd never learned the skill beyond the most basic level. Night sounds filtered through the walls, wind in the grass, coyotes in the distance, the creak and settle of the soddy itself, adjusting to temperature changes. Normal sounds that had never bothered her when Thomas was alive, but that now carried menace, every noise potentially the pre-disaster. She slept fitfully, waking every time Sarah stirred, lying in the darkness, listening to make sure the sounds outside remained ordinary. Once she thought she heard hoofbeats and sat bolt upright, heart hammering, before realizing it was just her imagination translating wind into something more threatening. The rifle leaned against the wall beside the bed, loaded as Brennan had checked before he left, though the thought of actually using it made her hands shake. Morning came as relief. Pale light through the window promising another day survived. Margaret rose and tended Sarah, built up the fire, ate a biscuit spread with the last scraping of butter from the crock. One more day until Brennan returned, assuming he kept his word. One more day of managing alone, of proving she could do this if she had to. But underneath the determination ran a current of fear she couldn't quite suppress. Not fear of dying, exactly, though that was part of it. Fear of something worse. Fear that she'd survive but Sarah wouldn't, or that they'd both survive but barely, scraping through winter and spring only to face the same impossible situation next year and the year after. Fear that this was her life. Now, endless struggle on the edge of catastrophe, Thomas's dream of a prosperous farm revealed as delusion that had cost him his life and might yet cost her hers. She was standing at the window watching the horizon for movement that wouldn't come for hours yet when Sarah started fussing in her cradle. Margaret picked her up, this tiny, warm weight that was somehow the center of everything now, the reason she couldn't just give up and let the prairie have her. Sarah needed milk and warmth and safety, needed her mother to be strong and capable and certain, even when Margaret felt none of those things. "Your papa would know what to do," Margaret whispered to the baby. "He always had a plan, always believed everything would work out. I don't know if I have that kind of faith, little one. But I'm going to try, because you deserve better than a mother who quits." The day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Margaret found herself counting hours, marking time until she could reasonably expect Brennan's return. She tried to calculate how long the ride to Elkhorn station would take, how long purchasing supplies might require, how long the return journey through snow-covered country. Every calculation ended with "sometime this evening," and she clung to that, using it to push through moments when panic threatened to overwhelm. By late afternoon she'd worn a path in the packed earth floor, pacing with Sarah, looking out the window every few minutes for signs of movement on the horizon. The animals needed tending, and she did it quickly, not wanting to be outside when darkness fell. The temperature was dropping again, promising another frigid night, and she checked the firewood supply with growing anxiety. Enough for tonight and maybe tomorrow, but not much beyond that, unless Brennan returned to cut more. Sunset came in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Margaret had been capable of appreciating beauty. Instead, she lit the lamp, barred the door, and settled in to wait. Sarah nursed and slept, unconcerned with adult anxieties. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, darkness swallowed the prairie whole. Margaret had just resigned herself to another night alone when she heard it. Definite hoofbeats this time, not imagination, coming from the northeast at a steady walk. She grabbed the rifle with shaking hands, positioned herself away from the window where she could see without being seen. The hoofbeats came closer, stopped outside. Then Brennan's voice, tired but unmistakable. "Margaret? It's me. I'm back." She set down the rifle and unbarred the door with hands that wouldn't quite steady, pulling it open to reveal Brennan snow-covered and saddle-weary, leading his horse that was loaded down with bulging packs. He looked exhausted but intact, exactly as promised. "Took longer than expected," he said, not quite apologizing. "Had to wait for the store to get a shipment in. Didn't want to leave without the grain for patients, but I got everything. Food, supplies, even some things you didn't know you needed." Margaret wanted to throw her arms around him in relief, but settled for stepping back to let him inside. "I was worried. I noticed the path you wore on the floor. Sorry about that. Should have figured you'd fret." He started unloading packs, setting them on the table. "But I'm here now, and we've got enough supplies to see you through till spring if we're careful. Things are going to be all right, Margaret. I promise you that." And standing in the lamplight, surrounded by the tangible proof of his return, his reliability, his fundamental decency, Margaret almost believed him, almost let herself hope that maybe, impossibly, they really would survive this after all. The supplies Brennan brought back from Elkhorn Station transformed the soddy from a place of bare survival into something closer to a functioning household. 50 pounds of flour, 20 of cornmeal, 10 of sugar, coffee beans, salt, baking powder, dried apples, and a wheel of cheese that would keep through winter if stored properly. He'd also brought grain for patients, oats for the horses, nails and wire and other hardware for repairs, and a bolt of flannel fabric that Margaret hadn't asked for, but nearly cried over when she saw it. "For the baby," Brennan explained, looking embarrassed by her reaction. "Figured she'd need clothes as she grows, and you can't exactly make them out of nothing." There were other unexpected items too. A tin of lard, making proper cooking possible again. A small jar of honey, luxury beyond measure. Soap, real soap, not the harsh lye stuff Margaret had been making from ashes. And tucked at the bottom of one pack, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a book. Not a practical manual or a Bible, but a novel. Something called The Last of the Mohicans that Brennan said the store owner had recommended. "Thought you might like something to read during the long evenings," he said, still not quite meeting her eyes. Being stuck inside with just a baby for company can make a person restless. The gesture touched her more than it probably should have. Not because of the cost, which couldn't have been much for a used book, but because it showed he'd been thinking about her needs beyond mere survival. Thinking about her mind, her spirit, the parts of a person that needed feeding as much as the body did. That night, they ate better than they had since before Thomas died. Brennan made biscuits with the fresh flour, while Margaret nursed Sarah, then fried salt pork in the lard and made gravy that tasted like heaven after weeks of thin soup and dry bread. They ate in comfortable silence, the lamplight warm, the stove radiating heat that actually pushed back the cold for once. "Store owner asked about you," Brennan said eventually, wiping his plate with a biscuit. Samuel Porter had been through town earlier in the week, mentioned Thomas's death. "Man at the store. Name of Dixon. He seemed surprised you were still out here. Asked if you needed help getting to family somewhere." Margaret stiffened. "What did you tell him?" "That you were managing fine, had decided to prove the homestead claim in your husband's name." He seemed skeptical but didn't press. Brennan paused. "There was talk, though, about a woman alone with a stranger. You should know that." Heat flooded Margaret's face. She'd been so focused on survival, she hadn't considered how their arrangement might look to outsiders. A widow, barely past childbirth, living with a man she'd known less than a week. The implications were obvious and damning by the standards of decent society. "Let them talk," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We know the truth of it. That's what matters." "Is it?" Brennan met her eyes across the table. "Because talk like that can follow a person, can make it hard when you eventually need to interact with town, need their goodwill for trade or help or just basic neighborliness. I don't care much what people think of me. I'm moving on regardless. But you have to live here. So what are you suggesting? That you leave to preserve my reputation?" "I'm suggesting we think about how this looks and whether there's a way to make it look better. Porter's place is 10 miles southwest. Maybe I should move there, help him with his claim in exchange for lodging. I could still check on you regular, make sure you and Sarah are managing." The thought of him leaving, even just to Porter's place, made Margaret's chest tighten with an anxiety that had nothing to do with practical concerns. She'd gotten used to his presence, to having someone else in the soddy, to not facing every decision alone. More than that, if she was honest with herself, she liked him. Liked his quiet competence, his dry observations about the world, the way he treated her as an equal rather than something fragile to be protected. "No," she said firmly. "You stay. I don't care what people in town think. You've been nothing but honorable, and anyone who suggests otherwise can take their opinions straight to hell." Brennan's eyebrows rose at the profanity, but he smiled slightly. "That's a strong position to take for someone who might need those people's help come spring. Then they can judge me while helping. But I won't send away the one person who's actually been here when I needed him, just to satisfy gossips I've never met." She stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something, with the emotion churning inside her. "Besides, your 2 weeks isn't even up yet." "You gave your word." "I did." He watched her pace the small space, Sarah asleep in her cradle, oblivious to adult complications. "All right then. I stay. We ignore the talk, and we focus on getting you properly set up before I move on. But Margaret, you need to understand eventually I am moving on. That job in Dakota Territory, it's real opportunity. I can't stay here indefinitely." "I know that." The words came out sharper than intended. "I've never expected you to stay. I'm not some damsel expecting rescue, Brennan. I just need help getting through the immediate crisis, then I'll manage on my own like I was always going to have to." The tension in the soddy was suddenly thick enough to cut. Brennan stood slowly, moving to the window to look out at darkness, broken only by snow's faint luminescence. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost gentle. "I wasn't suggesting you were helpless. Just trying to be clear about the situation so nobody gets hurt down the line. Who exactly are you worried about getting hurt?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Margaret felt her anger drain away, replaced by something more complicated. She wasn't the only one feeling the weight of proximity, of shared crisis building into something that looked uncomfortably like intimacy. The difference was, she had no choice about being here, no plans beyond survival. Brennan had a whole life waiting elsewhere, and getting attached would only make his leaving harder. "I'm going to check on the animals," he said, pulling on his coat. "Give us both some space to breathe." After he left, Margaret sat at the table with her head in her hands, trying to untangle what she was feeling. Gratitude, certainly. Brennan had saved her life, and Sarah's had worked himself near to exhaustion, making sure they'd survive the winter. But there was more to it than gratitude. She found herself watching him when he worked, noticing the way lamplight caught in his dark hair, the competent strength of his hands. She liked talking to him, liked the way he listened, like her thoughts mattered, liked even their disagreements, because they felt honest in a way most conversations didn't. This was dangerous territory. She'd buried Thomas barely 2 months ago. Her body was still healing from childbirth. Getting tangled up emotionally with a man who'd be gone in a matter of weeks was foolishness of the highest order. And yet, she couldn't quite make herself not care, couldn't reduce Brennan to just hired help or a temporary convenience. Sarah woke hungry, and Margaret nursed her, using the familiar task to ground herself. This was what mattered. Keeping Sarah alive, keeping them both fed and warm until spring, then figuring out how to work the claim and make it pay. Romance, attachment, whatever confused feelings she might be developing, none of that had any place in her reality. When Brennan returned an hour later, they'd both regained equilibrium, speaking carefully around what had almost been said. He reported the animals were fine, the temperature was dropping, but the buildings would hold. Margaret offered coffee, and they sat drinking it while she asked about his plans for the next days of work. "Need to hunt that deer I saw sign of," he said. "Get you set up with proper meat for the winter. After that, I'm thinking I should reinforce the soddy's roof before we get heavy snow. It's sagging in the middle. Won't take much weight before it caves in. Thomas meant to fix that in the fall. Just never got to it. Well, I'm getting to it now. Also noticed your chimney pipe is loose where it goes through the roof. That's a fire hazard, needs addressing." He listed other projects matter-of-factly, and Margaret realized with a start that he'd extended his own deadline. 2 weeks had been the original agreement. They were past that now, into a 3rd week, and he was planning work that would take him into a 4th. "The job in Dakota," she said carefully. "When do you have to be there?" "Contract starts the 1st of December. I've got time." It was November 17th. 2 weeks until his commitment elsewhere demanded he leave. 2 weeks to finish making the soddy secure, to teach her everything she'd need to know for managing alone, to prepare for the separation that was always coming. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt almost domestic. Brennan hunted in the early mornings, returning with rabbits, prairie chickens, and finally the deer he'd been tracking. He butchered it expertly, teaching Margaret how to preserve the meat, how to render the fat, how to use every part of the animal. The work was bloody and exhausting, but she forced herself to learn, knowing these were skills she'd need. Afternoons he spent on repairs. The roof got reinforced with new supports cut from cottonwood he hauled from the creek bottom. The chimney was secured properly. He built Margaret a proper shelf for storing supplies, installed hooks for hanging tools, fixed the bed frame that had been listing to one side since she'd tried to move it alone. Evenings they ate together and talked, gradually learning each other's histories in greater detail. Brennan told her about growing up on a hardscrabble farm in eastern Kansas, about the brother who'd inherited everything, about the wife who'd died young. Margaret talked about Ohio, about her father who'd wanted her to marry a banker's son, about choosing Thomas instead because he'd offered adventure and autonomy. "You got the adventure," Brennan observed one night. "Not sure about the autonomy." "No," Margaret agreed. "Turns out being alone isn't the same as being free. I'm more trapped now than I ever was in my father's house. You could still leave, sell the claim, use the money to go back to Ohio or somewhere else entirely, start over where nobody knows your story." She'd considered it, late at night when Sarah was asleep and the soddy felt like a prison. But where would she go? Back to Ohio and her father's contempt? To some city where she'd be just another widow struggling to survive? At least here she had land, had a legal claim to something that could potentially support them. "This is Sarah's inheritance," she said finally. "Her father died trying to build something here. I owe it to both of them to try." Brennan nodded, but his expression suggested he thought she was making things harder than necessary. Maybe she was. Maybe stubbornness would be her downfall. But giving up felt like admitting Thomas had died for nothing, and she couldn't accept that. The first serious test of their arrangement came during the 4th week, when a blizzard struck with almost no warning. One moment the day was cold but clear, the next the sky had gone white and wind was howling with enough force to tear at the soddy's roof. Brennan had been out checking the fence line and barely made it back, stumbling through the door half frozen, ice crusted in his beard and eyebrows. Margaret pulled him inside and got him out of his frozen outer clothes, her hands shaking as she worked buttons and laces. His skin was ice cold, his lips tinged blue. She wrapped him in every blanket they had and positioned him by the stove, feeding wood into the fire until it roared. "Stupid," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Saw it coming, thought I had more time. Don't talk, just get warm." She made him drink hot coffee laced with sugar, rubbed his hands and feet to restore circulation, piled more blankets on him until he stopped shaking quite so violently. Sarah fussed in her cradle, and Margaret tended her one-handed, unwilling to leave Brennan's side until she was certain he wasn't dangerously frozen. Gradually, color returned to his face, his breathing steadied. He caught her hand as she was adjusting his blankets, held it for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not panicking. I've gotten good at not panicking. Doesn't mean I'm not terrified. You hide it well." The storm lasted 3 days, keeping them trapped inside with provisions running lower than Margaret liked and firewood burning faster than they could afford. They rationed carefully, making each meal stretch, banking the fire at night to conserve wood. The enforced proximity was intense in ways that had nothing to do with the storm outside. On the 2nd day, with wind still howling and snow piling against the walls, Brennan started teaching Margaret to play cards using a worn deck he carried in his saddlebag. It was something to do besides sit in tense silence, and she found she was good at it, quick to learn strategy and unafraid to bluff. "You've got a poker face," Brennan observed after she won 3 hands in a row. "Wouldn't want to play you for money. Thomas always said I was unreadable when I wanted to be. Drove him crazy sometimes." "I can imagine." There was something in Brennan's voice, some undercurrent she couldn't quite identify. When she looked up from her cards, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What?" "Nothing. Just thinking you're not what I expected when I stopped here that night." "What did you expect?" "Someone more helpless, I suppose. Someone who needed rescuing. Instead, I found someone who just needed a hand up, someone strong enough to do the rest herself." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "You're not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I wasn't sure. Maybe someone who'd take advantage, or someone well-meaning but useless. Instead, I got someone competent and decent who's done more for us than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything, Margaret. I owe you everything. You know that." The air between them felt charged with something neither was willing to name. Brennan looked away first, gathering the cards with careful attention. "We should get some sleep. Storm might break tomorrow." But it didn't break the next day either, and the supplies were getting critically low. Brennan went out during a brief lull in the wind, fought his way to the lean-to to check on the animals, came back reporting they were hungry but alive. He'd managed to give them some of the hay and grain, but both were running out faster than ideal. That night, Margaret woke to Sarah crying and found Brennan already up, walking the small space with the baby against his shoulder, patting her back and humming something tuneless. In the lamplight, they looked peaceful together, this hard, weathered man and the tiny infant, and something in Margaret's chest cracked open. "I can take her," she said quietly. "She's fine. Just fussy. You rest." "Brennan." "Margaret, just let me help. It's what I'm here for." She watched him walk circles with her daughter, watched Sarah settle against him with complete trust, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. This wasn't just gratitude or convenience, or even the simple human need for connection. This was something more dangerous, something that was going to devastate her when he left. The storm finally broke on the morning of the fourth day, leaving the world buried under snow that had drifted against the soddy's walls halfway up to the roof. Brennan had to dig them out, creating a tunnel to reach the door, then paths to the lean-to and the well. The work took most of the day and left him exhausted. That evening they sat by the fire, not talking much, both aware that his departure was approaching and neither willing to discuss it. Sarah slept peacefully. The soddy was warm and secure. They had food and fuel enough to last. Everything was as good as it had been since Thomas died. And yet Margaret felt grief building like another storm on the horizon. Grief for what she was about to lose, for what she'd let herself feel despite knowing better, for the future stretching alone ahead of her once Brennan rode away toward Dakota and the life he'd always meant to live. 10 days, Brennan said finally, breaking the silence. That's how long until I need to leave to make it to Dakota on time. I know. We should use the time to make sure you're completely prepared. Go through everything one more time. Make sure you know how to handle whatever might come up. All right. Neither of them mentioned that no amount of preparation would change the fundamental reality. She'd be alone again, managing a homestead and a baby through a Nebraska winter with nothing but determination to see her through. And Brennan would be wherever he'd always been headed, helping with someone else's crisis, moving on because that's what he did. Outside, the wind picked up again, not a storm this time, but the constant prairie wind that never truly stopped. Inside the soddy, 2 people sat by firelight and pretended they hadn't already changed each other in ways that would matter long after distance separated them. The final 10 days took on a quality of desperate urgency, both Brennan and Margaret working as though they could forestall the inevitable separation through sheer productivity. He rose before dawn each morning, accomplishing by noon what would have taken another man a full day. She pushed herself harder than was wise for someone still recovering from childbirth, learning skills in days that normally took months to master. Brennan taught her to butcher game properly, walking her through the process with a rabbit he'd trapped, explaining which cuts to save and which to use immediately. His hands guided hers with the knife, showing her the angle to work the blade, where the joints separated cleanly. The proximity made her acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of him standing close, the rough timbre of his voice near her ear. "You're thinking too much," he said when she hesitated over a difficult cut. "Trust your hands to know what to do." She forced herself to focus on the work rather than the man, and gradually the rabbit became recognizable pieces of meat rather than an overwhelming task. By the 3rd attempt, she could manage it alone, though not with Brennan's efficiency. He nodded approval when she finished, and the small gesture of pride warmed her more than she wanted to admit. They worked through a mental list of potential disasters, preparing for each. What if the cow went dry? Brennan showed her how to supplement with the goat milk another homesteader had offered to trade. What if the well froze, despite their insulation? He dug a backup access point to the creek, marked it with stakes she could find even in deep snow. What if she ran out of firewood? He cut and stacked enough to last through March, then showed her where to find dead timber if she needed more. He also taught her to shoot properly. Thomas had shown her the basics with the rifle, but Brennan took her through maintenance, loading, aiming at targets he set up at varying distances. Her shoulders ached from the recoil, but she practiced until she could hit what she aimed at more often than not. "You're not going to win any competitions," Brennan observed, after she managed 3 hits out of 5 on a target 50 yards distant. "But you can defend yourself and bring down game if you need to. That's what matters." They were standing in the snow behind the soddy, afternoon sun slanting across the prairie, when Margaret lowered the rifle and turned to face him directly. "Why are you doing all this? Teaching me everything, preparing for every possible problem. You could have left a week ago and satisfied your conscience." Brennan was quiet for a long moment. his eyes on the horizon rather than her face. Maybe my conscience isn't as easily satisfied as it should be. That's not an answer. No, I suppose it isn't. He took the rifle from her, checked it automatically before setting it aside. Truth is, I don't entirely know why I'm still here. Started out as just doing the right thing, helping someone who needed it. But somewhere along the way, it became more complicated. Complicated how? He met her eyes finally, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. You know how. You're a smart woman, Margaret. You've noticed the same things I have. She had. The way conversation came easier between them now. The comfortable silences that felt like communication in themselves. The moments when their hands brushed passing something, and both of them felt the contact like a shock. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, like he was trying to memorize her face. Noticing doesn't change anything, she said quietly. You're still leaving, I'm still staying, and we're both still carrying ghosts that won't let us be anything other than what we are right now. Your ghost or mine? Both. Thomas has been dead less than 3 months. Some days I can barely remember what he looked like, and that feels like betrayal. And you? She stopped, uncertain how to finish. I've been running from Caroline's memory for 8 years, Brennan said, surprising her with the directness. Telling myself I was moving on when really I was just moving. Never staying anywhere long enough to build something new, because building something new felt like admitting she was really gone. Is that what this is? You building something? I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just making excuses because the thought of leaving you and Sarah out here alone makes me feel like I'm abandoning my own family. He shook his head. Which is ridiculous since you're not my family, and I've only known you a handful of weeks. Time worked differently in crisis, Margaret had learned. A few weeks of intensity could forge connections that years of ordinary life might never create. She'd known Thomas for 6 months before they married, had spent 2 years building a life with him. She'd known Brennan less than a month, but in some ways she knew him better, had seen him in extremity, had trusted him with her life, and Sarah's, had worked alongside him in the raw honesty that crisis demanded. What if you didn't go? The words came out before she could stop them. What if you stayed instead? Worked this claim with me, helped make Thomas's dream real. Brennan's expression shifted to something pained. Margaret, I know it's not fair to ask. I know you have plans, a whole life waiting elsewhere. But I'm asking anyway because I don't want to do this alone anymore, and because I think maybe you don't want to be alone either. It's not about what I want, his voice was rough. It's about what's right, what's proper. You're a widow barely past mourning. I'm a drifter with no claim to respectability. People in town already talk. If I stayed, it would only get worse, and you're the one who'd pay the price. Let them talk. I told you before. I don't care. You should care. Sarah should care. What happens when she's old enough to hear gossip about her mother and the stranger who moved in right after her father died? How does that serve her? Margaret wanted to argue but couldn't find solid ground. He was right about the optics, right about the potential damage to Sarah's future. Western society might be more forgiving than Eastern parlors, but there were still limits, still lines that couldn't be crossed without consequences. So what do we do? She asked, hating how her voice cracked. Pretend this is just business? Shake hands when you leave and wish each other well like none of it mattered? It matters. Brennan stepped closer, close enough she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes. It matters more than is probably wise. But mattering doesn't change reality. I leave in 9 days. You stay here and build the life Thomas wanted for you and Sarah, and maybe in a year or 2 years, when enough time has passed that people won't judge, maybe then we can revisit what this is between us. A year is a long time. 2 years is forever. You could be anywhere by then, doing anything with anyone. So could you? No, Margaret said firmly. I'll be right here, because I don't have the luxury of drifting, of reinventing myself somewhere new. This land is all I have, and I'll be on it until it kills me or I prove it up. So if you're leaving, if you're choosing that job in Dakota over staying here, you need to understand that you're making a final choice, not a temporary one." The words hung between them like a challenge. Brennan's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "You're asking me to give up everything I planned, everything I worked toward, to stay on a hard-scrabble claim that might fail, and tie myself to a woman I've known less than a month. That's not reasonable, Margaret. I'm not asking you to be reasonable. I'm asking you to be honest about what you want. What I want isn't relevant. It's the only thing that's relevant." Her voice rose, and Sarah, startled in the soddy, beginning to cry. Margaret took a breath, forcing herself to calm. "What I want matters. What you want matters. And yes, what's proper and reasonable matters too. But somewhere in all those calculations, there has to be room for what we're actually feeling instead of what we're supposed to feel." Brennan looked like he wanted to argue further, but instead turned away, shoulders tense. "I need to check the fence line. We'll talk about this later." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Margaret standing in the snow with a crying baby and a heart that felt like it was tearing in half. She went inside and tended Sarah, nursing her with hands that shook, trying to understand why she'd pushed when she knew it would only make things harder. That evening, they moved around each other carefully, speaking only about necessary things. Where should the extra grain be stored? Did Margaret understand the system for rationing firewood? Brennan had written out detailed instructions for everything, pages of careful notes she could refer to when problems arose. Looking at his precise handwriting, Margaret realized he was preparing to leave thoroughly, making sure she'd have no reason to need him once he was gone. The thought made her angry and sad in equal measure. She didn't want to need him, but she did. Wanted his presence, his partnership, the feeling of working toward something together rather than struggling alone. And underneath that practical need was something deeper, something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the way he made her feel seen and valued and stronger than she'd ever known she could be. 3 days before his planned departure, disaster struck in the form Margaret least expected. She woke in the middle of the night to Sarah screaming, not the normal fussy cry of hunger, but something high-pitched and desperate. The baby felt hot to the touch, her tiny body burning with fever that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Margaret tried everything she could think of. Cool cloths, gentle rocking, offering the breast, though Sarah couldn't seem to latch properly. Nothing helped. The baby screamed until she was hoarse, then whimpered, then screamed again. By dawn, Margaret was frantic, pacing the soddy with a sick child and no idea what to do. Brennan took one look at Sarah's flushed face and fever-bright eyes and cursed quietly. "This needs a doctor, real medical help, not guesswork. The nearest doctor is in Elkhorn Station, and he might not even be there. He travels a circuit. Then we ride to Elkhorn Station and hope we get lucky." Brennan was already moving, gathering supplies, saddling his horse. "Bundle her warm, bring extra blankets. We leave in 5 minutes. Margaret wanted to argue that she wasn't well enough for such a ride, that 23 miles on horseback would be brutal, that they didn't even know if the doctor would be there. But Sarah's cries made the argument impossible. Her daughter needed help Margaret couldn't provide, and pride had no place in that equation. Brennan lifted her into the saddle like she weighed nothing, then handed up Sarah bundled in every soft cloth they had. He swung up behind Margaret, his arms coming around to hold the reins, creating a protective circle that enclosed both her and the baby. "Hold on tight," he said near her ear. "We're going to move fast." The ride became a blur of cold and motion, and Sarah's intermittent cries. Brennan pushed the horse harder than was wise, cutting across country rather than following the road, choosing the straightest line toward town. Margaret clung to the saddle horn and tried to shield Sarah from the worst of the wind, her body aching within the first hour, but fear for her daughter overriding every other concern. They reached Elkhorn Station near midday, the horse lathered and blowing, Margaret barely able to stand when Brennan lifted her down. He supported her with one arm while carrying Sarah with the other, heading directly for the building that served as both general store and occasional medical office. Providence smiled on them for once. The doctor was there, an elderly man named Hutchins, who took one look at Sarah and gestured them to a back room. He examined the baby with gentle competence, while Margaret hovered anxiously and Brennan stood silent but tense near the door. "Fever's high, but not dangerously so," Hutchins announced finally. "Probably just colic, combined with some chest congestion, common in infants this young, especially in cold weather. Nothing that requires extreme measures." Relief made Margaret's legs weak. "So she'll be all right. Should be fine within a few days. Keep her warm, make sure she's nursing regularly. I'll give you some medicine to help with the congestion." He mixed something in a small bottle, explaining dosage carefully. "You came all the way from the Whitley claim?" "Yes." Hutchins looked between Margaret and Brennan with obvious curiosity. "Long ride for a woman who gave birth recently. Dangerous, even." "My daughter needed help," Margaret said firmly. The distance was irrelevant. The doctor nodded, but his expression suggested he was filing away information about the widow Whitley and her male companion. Margaret saw Brennan notice the same thing, saw his jaw tighten with resignation. By nightfall, everyone in Elkhorn Station would know they'd come to town together, know Brennan had been staying at her claim, know all the details that would feed speculation. They stayed that night at the boarding house, Brennan paying for 2 rooms, though Margaret suspected it wouldn't matter to gossip, which insisted on scandal. Sarah's fever broke around midnight, the medicine and warmth of an actual heated room doing what Margaret's desperate prayers hadn't managed on the prairie. In the morning, they prepared for the return journey. Margaret was paying for supplies with the last of her money when Samuel Porter appeared in the general store, his weather-beaten face showing surprise at seeing them. "Heard you were in town," he said by way of greeting. "Heard some other things too, about the arrangement out at your place." Margaret stiffened. "Then you heard I have help getting through winter. Nothing more scandalous than survival, Mr. Porter. Survival takes different forms." Porter's eyes moved to Brennan. "You planning on staying permanent, or is this a temporary charity?" "Leaving in 2 days," Brennan said evenly. "Got a job waiting in Dakota Territory, just making sure Mrs. Whitley and her daughter are set up proper before I go." Something in Porter's expression eased slightly. "Well then, when you do leave, she'll have a neighbor who can check in regular. My claim's only 10 miles southwest. I can ride over once a week, make sure nothing's gone catastrophically wrong." It was an olive branch of sorts, an acknowledgement that help didn't have to come with judgment. Margaret accepted it gratefully. "Thank you. That would ease my mind considerably." The ride back to the claim was slower, gentler, Sarah sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms, while Brennan guided the horse carefully across frozen ground. They didn't speak much, both aware that their time together was measured now in hours rather than days. That night, their last night before his planned departure, they sat by the fire after Sarah was asleep. The silence between them felt weighted with everything unsaid, all the possibilities they'd circled around without quite touching. "I could delay another week," Brennan said finally. "Make sure Sarah's completely recovered, that you're managing all right after the trip to town." "No." Margaret's voice was quiet but certain. "If you're going, go now. Delaying just makes it harder. For you. Or for me. Both." He nodded slowly. "You'll write if you need anything? Porter knows how to reach me through the ranch in Dakota. They have telegraph there, could get a message to me within days if it was urgent." "I'll write." Though they both knew she wouldn't, knew that reaching out would only prolong something that needed to end cleanly. Brennan stood and moved to the small pile of his belongings he'd packed earlier. He pulled something from his saddlebag and brought it to her, the book he'd bought in Elkhorn Station, The Last of the Mohicans, that she'd been too busy to even open. "Keep this," he said, "something to remember that you're more than just a mother and a homesteader. You're someone with a mind that needs feeding, dreams that matter." Margaret took the book, her fingers brushing his, and felt tears threatening. I don't need a book to remember you. No. But maybe someday you'll read it and remember what it felt like to have someone who saw you clearly and thought you were extraordinary anyway. The words broke something open in her chest. She stood abruptly, closed the distance between them, and kissed him. Not tentatively or questioningly, but with all the certainty she'd been suppressing for weeks. Brennan went still for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her, pulling her close, kissing her back with an intensity that made her dizzy. It lasted only moments before he pulled away, breathing hard, his hands on her shoulders, keeping her at arm's length. Margaret, we can't. I know. I know all the reasons why we can't. But I needed you to know that this is real, what's between us. That if circumstances were different, if timing were different, this could be something that mattered. It already matters, Brennan said roughly. That's the problem. It matters too much to be something I can just walk away from without it tearing me apart. Then stay. Don't walk away. Choose this. Choose us. Choose building something instead of running. For a moment she thought he might actually agree. Saw something shift in his expression that looked like surrender. Then he stepped back, put distance between them, shook his head. I can't. You deserve better than a drifter who's never stayed anywhere longer than a season. Sarah deserves better. And I deserve a chance to see if I can actually hold down something permanent before I promise you a future I might not be capable of providing. It was the most honest thing he'd said, and it hurt precisely because it made sense. Margaret nodded, swallowing tears, finding a smile she didn't feel. Then go to Dakota Territory, take the job. Build the life you're meant to have. And if, in a year, or 2 years, or 5, you find yourself thinking that maybe permanent isn't as scary as you thought, you know where I'll be. Still here on this claim, fighting the prairie and winning. Still here, she agreed, being extraordinary whether anyone sees it or not. They stood looking at each other across the small space of the soddy, both understanding this was goodbye, even though he wouldn't leave until morning. Some things ended not with grand gestures, but with quiet acknowledgement of reality, with choosing what was right over what was wanted. Brennan retreated behind his blanket curtain. Margaret checked Sarah one last time, then lay down in the bed alone, listening to the prairie wind and the crackle of the dying fire, memorizing the sound of another person breathing in the darkness while she still could. Tomorrow he would ride away, and she would begin the work of surviving without him. But tonight, for these last few hours, she could let herself imagine a different ending to their story, one where circumstances aligned, where timing worked, where the extraordinary thing they'd built in crisis could transform into something permanent and real. It was a beautiful dream. And in the morning, she'd wake up and face reality instead. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of crystalline morning that made the prairie look almost forgiving in its frozen beauty. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee already brewing and the sound of Brennan moving quietly around the soddy, gathering the last of his belongings. Sarah slept peacefully in her cradle, her fever completely gone, tiny fists curled beside her face in complete trust that the world would provide what she needed. Margaret lay still for a moment, postponing the inevitable, then forced herself to rise. Brennan glanced up when she emerged from behind the blanket she'd hung for privacy, his expression carefully neutral in the way it had been since last night's conversation. "Coffee's ready," he said. "Made extra biscuits too. Figured you could use the food once I'm gone." The casual mention of his departure made it real in a way nothing else had. Margaret accepted the coffee and sat at the table, watching him move through final preparations with the efficiency she'd come to recognize as his way of managing emotion. When Jacob Brennan had feelings he didn't know what to do with, he worked. "Horse is saddled," he reported. "I left extra grain in the lean-to, should last patience another month at least. The firewood stacked and covered fence line is solid, well insulated. You've got the rifle cleaned and loaded, ammunition stored dry. Instructions for everything are in that folder on the shelf. You've thought of everything. Tried to. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her, both of them aware this was the last time they'd share a meal this way. Porter said he'd check on you, weekly. If you need anything before then, you can ride to his place. I drew you a map showing the route. The store in Elkhorn Station will extend you credit now that Dixon knows you're determined to stay. And come spring, when you're selling butter and eggs, you'll be able to pay down any debt. Margaret nodded, taking in information she already knew, understanding he needed to say it all one more time. To convince himself he was leaving her truly prepared, not just abandoning her to struggle alone. "I'll manage," she said quietly. "You've done more than anyone could reasonably expect. Sarah and I will be fine." "I know you will." He met her eyes over his coffee cup. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Margaret Whitley. This Prairie doesn't stand a chance against you." They finished breakfast in silence, broken only by the stove's crackle and Sarah's small sleeping sounds. When the coffee was gone and the biscuits eaten, there was nothing left to delay with. Brennan stood, pulled on his heavy coat, settled his hat low against the cold. "I'll write when I reach the ranch," he said. "Let you know I made it safely." After that, he trailed off, both of them understanding that after that there would likely be silence. Distance measured not just in miles, but in the diverging paths of separate lives. "After that, you focus on your job and your future," Margaret finished for him. "Build something permanent like you said you wanted to try." Brennan nodded, then did something unexpected. He moved to Sarah's cradle and looked down at the sleeping infant for a long moment. When he straightened, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "You take care of your mama," he told the baby softly. "She's going to teach you to be strong and brave and extraordinary. Pay attention." Then he turned to Margaret, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her goodbye. Instead, he took her hand, squeezed it once, then let go and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back at the soddy's cramped interior, at the woman and child he'd helped keep alive, at the temporary home that had somehow become more significant than any place he'd stayed in years. "If you need me," he started. "I know where you'll be," Margaret interrupted. "But I won't need you. You made sure of that." Something passed across his face, gratitude or regret or some combination of both. Then he nodded once and stepped outside into the bright, cold morning. Margaret followed to the doorway, watching as he mounted his horse, settled his weight in the saddle, took up the reins. He looked at her one last time, and in that look was everything they'd left unsaid. The connection forged in crisis, the possibilities explored and ultimately set aside, the understanding that some things mattered intensely even when they couldn't be sustained. Then he turned his horse northeast toward Elkhorn Station and the trail beyond it that would take him to Dakota Territory and whatever future waited there. Margaret watched until he disappeared over the first rise, watched until the prairie had swallowed him completely, watched until there was nothing left to see but endless snow and empty sky. Only then did she allow herself to cry, standing in the doorway of her soddy, with tears freezing on her cheeks and her daughter sleeping peacefully inside. She cried for Thomas, dead and buried on the rise to the east. She cried for herself, alone again in a way that felt more profound than before Brennan arrived. And she cried for what might have been if circumstances had aligned differently, if a widow's mourning period were measured in feeling rather than calendar months, if a drifter could have believed himself capable of staying. When the tears were spent, she wiped her face, went inside, and barred the door. Sarah was beginning to stir, making the small sounds that preceded demands for feeding. Margaret picked her up, settled into the chair, and began the work of continuing on. The first week alone was harder than she'd expected. Not because she couldn't manage the tasks Brennan had taught her well, but because the silence was overwhelming. She'd gotten used to another voice in the soddy, another presence to bounce thoughts off of, someone to share the small observations that made up daily life. Now there was only Sarah, who couldn't respond, and the endless quiet of the prairie. But Margaret had survived worse than loneliness. She established new routines, speaking aloud to Sarah as she worked, narrating their days as though the baby could understand. She read from The Last of the Mohicans in the evenings, finding comfort in the story's forward momentum, its certainty that struggle led somewhere meaningful. True to his word, Samuel Porter rode over on the seventh day, appearing mid-morning on a sturdy sorrel mare. He checked the livestock with a practiced eye, examined Brennan's repairs, nodded approval. Man knew what he was doing, Porter observed. These repairs will hold through winter, and then some. He was thorough. Porter studied her with shrewd eyes. You sorry he left? Margaret considered the question seriously. Sorry, and relieved both. Grateful he came. Grateful he taught me what I needed to know. But it's easier in some ways to do this alone than to miss having someone. Alone's hard, though, Porter said. Speaking from experience, my claim's been lonesome as hell since I started it 3 years back, but I'm stubborn and the land's good, so I stay. They talked for an hour about practical matters, crop rotations, water management, which merchants in Elkhorn Station were fair and which would cheat a woman given half a chance. When Porter left, he promised to return the following week, and Margaret believed him. He was a man who kept his word, even if his word didn't come with Brennan's unexpected gentleness. The letter from Dakota Territory arrived in late December, brought by Porter on one of his weekly visits. The envelope was creased from travel, addressed in Brennan's careful hand. Margaret waited until Porter had left before opening it, settling by the stove with Sarah asleep and the lamp burning low. The letter was brief, factual. He'd made the journey safely. The ranch was well run, the work challenging but good. The country was beautiful in its own harsh way, different from Nebraska but no less demanding. He hoped she and Sarah were managing, hoped the winter was treating them kindly. He'd heard from Porter that she was holding up admirably, which he'd known she would. At the bottom, in slightly less controlled handwriting, he'd added, I think about you both more than is probably wise. Take care of yourself, Margaret. You deserve every good thing the future holds. She read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in the trunk with Thomas's few letters from before they married. 2 men, 2 different futures that had intersected with her life and then diverged again, leaving her alone on the prairie with a daughter to raise and a claim to prove. Winter deepened through January and into February. The supplies Brennan had purchased held out exactly as he'd calculated. The repairs he'd made kept the soddy warm and dry through blizzards that would have destroyed it otherwise. Margaret found herself thinking of him at odd moments when she successfully butchered a rabbit using the techniques he'd taught, when she reinforced a weak spot in the fence line just as he'd shown her, when she managed to keep the fire burning through a 3-day storm because she'd remembered his lessons about airflow and fuel conservation. Sarah grew, changing daily in the way infants did, becoming more alert and responsive. She'd smile now when Margaret spoke to her, track movement with eyes that were starting to shade toward blue like Thomas's had been. Margaret told her stories about her father, about the dream he'd had for this land, about how much he would have loved her. But she also found herself including Brennan in the narratives, the man who'd helped bring her into the world, who'd kept them both alive through their most vulnerable time. February gave way to March, and with it came the first hints that winter might eventually release its grip. The days lengthened perceptibly. Snow began melting during daylight hours, though it still froze hard at night. Margaret started planning for spring planting, reviewing Thomas's notes about which crops did best in prairie soil, thinking about how she'd manage the work with an infant to care for. Porter's weekly visits continued, gradually shifting from welfare checks to something more like friendship. He brought news from town, small luxuries when he could, a jar of jam, a newspaper, once a rattle for Sarah that he'd carved himself from cottonwood. Margaret repaid him with butter and cheese from Patience's milk, the beginnings of the trade economy that would sustain her. On a mild day in late March, Porter brought more than news. He brought a letter, this one from a lawyer in Iowa City, Thomas's cousin, had responded to Margaret's notification of his death, and the response was unexpected. The cousin was willing to buy out Thomas's homestead claim for a fair price, enough money that Margaret could return to Ohio, or settle in a town somewhere, or do anything except continue struggling on the prairie alone. "That's a way out," Porter observed when Margaret explained the letter. "Honorable way to leave without feeling like you're abandoning your husband's dream." Margaret looked around the soddy. At the cradle Thomas had carved, and the repairs Brennan had made, and the life she'd somehow constructed from disaster and determination. She thought about Ohio, about the civilized world she'd left behind, about the ease of living where help was close and winters were less brutal and women weren't expected to run homesteads alone. Then she looked at Sarah, 6 months old now, healthy and thriving despite everything. This baby was prairie-born, had survived what would have killed a frailer child. She deserved to grow up knowing the land that had tested her so early, deserved to inherit the claim her father had died trying to prove. "No," Margaret said firmly. "Tell the cousin thank you, but no. This land is Sarah's birthright. I'm staying." Porter nodded like he'd expected that answer. "You'll need help come planting season. I can spare some days, and there's a family settled about 15 miles east who might trade labor. Won't be easy, but it's doable if you're determined." "I'm determined." Spring arrived in earnest through April, transforming the prairie from brown desolation into seas of green growth. Margaret planted 40 acres with help from Porter and the family he'd mentioned, the Hendersons. Her body had regained its strength, and she found she could work a full day in the field with Sarah wrapped against her back, the baby content to drowse while her mother turned soil and planted seed. The work was back-breaking, harder than anything she'd done before. But there was satisfaction in it too, in watching seeds she'd planted begin to sprout, in seeing the land respond to her labor. This was what Thomas had wanted to build, and she was building it. Not quite the way he'd envisioned, but built nonetheless. In May, a second letter came from Dakota Territory. Brennan's handwriting, but the content was different from the first letter's careful distance. The ranch work was going well, but he was restless in ways he couldn't quite explain. He'd been offered a permanent position as foreman, good money, and real responsibility. It was exactly what he'd said he wanted, a chance to prove he could stay somewhere and build something lasting. But he couldn't stop thinking about Nebraska, about a soddy on the prairie and a woman raising a daughter alone, and whether he'd made the right choice in leaving. He wasn't asking permission to return, the letter made clear. Just wanted her to know he was thinking about what came next, about whether the permanent position he was building in Dakota was the one he actually wanted. Margaret wrote back for the first time, her response carefully composed over several evenings. She told him about the planting, about Sarah's growth, about the life she was constructing day by day. She was managing, just as he'd known she would. She'd be fine whether he returned or not, though if he did decide to come back, there might be a place for him. Not out of need, she'd proven she could survive without him, but out of choice, because building something together was better than building alone, and because what they'd started in crisis deserved a chance to become something more in calmer times. She didn't mail the letter immediately. Instead, she tucked it in the trunk, with Brennan's letters and Thomas's, waiting for certainty about what she actually wanted. Days turned into weeks, spring became early summer, and still the letter remained unsent. Then, one evening in late June, as Margaret was putting Sarah to bed after a long day working the claim, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle before she recognized the silhouette against the sunset. Tall rider on a familiar horse, moving at a steady walk toward the soddy like he had every right to be there. Jacob Brennan had come back. Margaret walked outside slowly, Sarah on her hip, watching him dismount and tie his horse with the same economical movements she remembered. He turned to face her, and she saw uncertainty in his expression that hadn't been there before. "I wrote you a letter," she said instead of greeting. "Never sent it. It's inside if you want to read it." "Does it say, 'I'm welcome here'?" "That depends." Are you passing through or staying? Brennan removed his hat, turned it in his hands. Depends on the answer to a question I need to ask. It's been 8 months since I left. Respectable mourning period by any standard. And I spent every one of those months in Dakota doing exactly what I said. I wanted building something permanent, proving I could stay put. Turns out the only place I want to stay is here. Margaret's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. Here meaning Nebraska, or here meaning this specific claim. Here meaning with you and Sarah, if you'll have me. Not as help or charity or temporary solution. As a partner in building this life you're creating. As someone who wants to see you prove up this claim and raise your daughter and turn Thomas's dream into reality. And maybe as something more, if you think enough time has passed, that more is acceptable. She looked at him, standing in the evening light. This man who delivered her baby and saved her life, and left when honor demanded it, and come back when he couldn't stay away any longer. She thought about Thomas, whose dream this had been, and wondered if he'd begrudge her finding someone to share the burden of fulfilling it. Somehow she thought he wouldn't. Thomas had been practical above all else. He'd want Sarah raised in a real partnership, would want the land worked by people committed to its success. Sarah needs a father, Margaret said finally. The claim needs 2 people working it to succeed. And I need someone who sees me as a partner, not a woman requiring rescue. Can you be those things? I can try. Have been trying, in fact, for 8 months, without much success at being anywhere but here in my mind. Then yes, Margaret said, you're welcome here, as a partner, as Sarah's father if she'll have you, and as something more when we're both ready for more. Brennan's expression transformed into something Margaret had never seen before, pure, uncomplicated joy. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and pulled them both into an embrace, careful of Sarah but fierce with relief. I brought supplies, he said against Margaret's hair, and money saved from my wages, and a letter from the ranch owner offering me permanent work if Dakota doesn't suit. But I'm hoping Nebraska suits better, because I'm done running from what matters. Sarah, trapped between them, made an indignant sound and both adults laughed, separating enough to let the baby breathe. Margaret looked up at Brennan and saw her future written in his face. Not easy, never easy, but built on genuine partnership and hard-won respect, and the knowledge that they'd both survived the worst and come through stronger. Come inside, she said. There's stew on the stove and coffee in the pot and a letter you should probably read. Then we can talk about how to make this work for real. They walked into the soddy together, Sarah between them, the prairie wind soft for once as evening settled over land that would test them and shape them, and ultimately, with enough work and luck and stubborn determination, provide the future Thomas had imagined and Margaret was building, and Brennan had finally stopped running long enough to claim as his own. The story that had begun with a woman alone in crisis had transformed into something neither Margaret nor Brennan had expected. Not rescue, not romance in the simple sense, but partnership forged through shared struggle and honest about the work still ahead. The Prairie had taken Thomas Whitley, had nearly taken Margaret and Sarah too, but it had also brought Jacob Brennan to their door at exactly the moment they needed him most, and had sent him away long enough for everyone to understand what staying actually meant. Now they would build something together on land that demanded everything and promised nothing, but they'd build it as partners, as a family chosen rather than assumed, as people who understood that survival was just the beginning and that real life happened in the work of turning survival into something worth having survived for. Outside, night fell over the Nebraska prairie, stars emerging in a sky vast enough to contain all their hopes and fears and determination. Inside the soddy, 3 people sat down to a simple meal, beginning the rest of their lives with no illusions about the difficulty ahead, but with genuine commitment to facing it together. It was enough. It was everything. It was the new beginning they'd all earned through fire and fear, and the simple human courage of continuing on when continuation seemed impossible. And tomorrow, they'd wake up and start building. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.